Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something today that I think we've all wondered about at some point.
Ooh, I'm intrigued already.
It's a pretty common question, actually. Do married couples and couples who are just living together, cohabitating, do they argue differently?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, you sent in some really fascinating research on this, and we're going to try to break it all down. It looks like we're going to be focusing on the big three, right? Like the
Yeah.
classic relationship things, household chores, finances, and life goals, all
Yeah,
that.
you hit the nail on the head, those big relationship hurdles, right?
Exactly.
And what's so interesting about what we found is it might actually surprise you a little bit. We tend to think about arguments as just kind of like part of relationships in general. But the research suggests that how we deal with these disagreements, how we argue, it can actually change depending on if you're married or if you're living together but not married.
Okay, that's already got me hooked. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we found that's super interesting is that couples who are living together, cohabitating, they seem to have a more, I guess you could say, go with the flow approach to things,
Mm.
especially when it comes to like money and who does what around the house, like splitting chores and stuff. And it's not necessarily that they're doing it on purpose. It's more like there isn't that same like formal structure that you kind of get with marriage, whether that's good or bad.
So it's like you're living together and things are good, so you just figure, hey, we'll just figure it out as we go. But then all of a sudden you're like 6 months in and you realize, wait a minute, I've been paying for groceries every single time.
Yeah. That is the perfect example. And the research shows that this kind of like unspoken assumptions thing and the resentment that can come from that, it's way more common in couples who are living together but aren't married. And then on the flip side, married couples, maybe because of that deeper commitment, they tend to be more upfront about setting expectations for each other, even for those little things like, okay, who's doing the dishes?
So it's not necessarily that they like having those, who's scrubbing the toilet this week in conversations, but they're more motivated to, set those ground rules from the get-go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the studies show that a whopping 60%, that's a huge number, 60% of couples who are living together, they report having like major arguments about finances at least once a month, compared to just 35% of married couples.
Whoa, that's a big difference.
It is a big
So
difference.
why is that?
Well, it might be because marriage kind of encourages this whole let's build a system mentality, you know? Like maybe they're just more likely to sit down and create a budget spreadsheet or actually like write down a chore chart, which let's be real, nobody really wants to do, but
Yeah.
it can actually help prevent a lot of those smaller arguments from popping up in the first place.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So are you saying that married couples are just naturally good at these serious relationship talks?
Yeah.
It's not like they took a class on it.
Right, exactly. No one hands you a manual on how to argue when you say, I do.
Mhm.
But what surprised us is that the commitment of marriage seems to give couples an extra push to actually resolve arguments instead of just like letting things simmer.
Yeah, I can see that if you've made this lifelong promise to someone, you're probably a lot more willing to work through disagreements, even if it means compromising on who vacuums. But what about couples who aren't married? Does that mean they're just sweeping these issues under the rug?
Well, it's not necessarily about avoiding things altogether. It's more that without that same level of commitment, the motivation to even have the conversations, it just might not be as strong, you know? Like if you're not sure if the relationship is going to last forever, you might not feel the same sense of urgency to hash out who's loading the dishwasher.
I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
Avoiding a potentially awkward conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And this can be even more true when it comes to those really big long-term goals. Like, think about it. Marriage kind of comes pre-packaged with this idea of building a life together, right? So it makes those conversations about kids or careers or even retirement, those big, sometimes scary topics, they feel more natural to have.
But for couples who aren't married, those same topics could feel way more loaded, right? Like, whoa, hold on. Are we even at that stage yet?
Exactly. So while no one is saying that couples who are living together are doomed to argue more, it's more like the way their relationships work, the dynamics, they might not create that same pressure to like formalize things the way that marriage kind of does just by its nature.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
This whole conversation is reminding me of something we read in one of your sources. They describe marriage as like having a roadmap, while cohabitating can feel more like wandering around, without a clear destination in mind.
Ooh, that is such a good way to put it. That's a powerful image. It really highlights how married couples often have this foundation of a shared commitment to guide them, even when they're, navigating those tricky topics. While couples who are living together might still be in that stage of figuring out that next level, which can make those big conversations feel so much more daunting, for sure. So we've seen how marriage can kind of naturally create a structure for those tough conversations.
But what about the rest of us? What about those of us who aren't married? I bet a lot of people listening are thinking like, okay, well, that's great, but how do we create those same structures if we're not married?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the good news is it's totally doable. It just takes a bit of effort and being intentional about it. It's kind of like, creating your own relationship rule book, even without having that formal commitment of marriage.
Hold on. What exactly do you mean by relationship rule book? Like, are we talking about an actual written document here or?
It doesn't have to be a literal book, although, hey, some couples might find that helpful. It's more about just being proactive and having those open and honest conversations about, you know, what you both expect and how you want to handle things, like responsibilities and stuff. It's about making the choice to build that framework yourselves rather than waiting for, marriage to do it for you.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So where do couples even begin with something like that?
Well, it all starts with communication, just like in any healthy relationship, right? But for couples who are living together, it's about taking that communication to the next level and having some really structured conversations, not just, venting frustrations, but actually sitting down and setting clear expectations for how you want to handle things.
So instead of just like hoping your partner is going to magically start doing more laundry,
Yeah.
you actually sit down and have a conversation about like how to divide those chores fairly.
Exactly. It's about turning those unspoken assumptions into clear agreements. Like, maybe you create a chore chart. Maybe you alternate weeks. Maybe you both realize you absolutely hate folding laundry and you decide to splurge on a laundry service. The solution itself isn't as important as the fact that you're talking about it openly and finding a system that actually works for both of you.
Yeah, I love that. It's not about one person being right or wrong, but finding that compromise that feels fair to both partners.
Now, just like those chore charts, getting on the same page financially can be a huge game changer for couples who are living together. Instead of just assuming you'll figure it out, as you go along, creating a clear financial plan together can prevent so much stress down the road.
So are we talking about having those sometimes awkward, sometimes nitty-gritty money conversations, like who pays what bills, how much each person contributes to shared expenses, whether or not you have a joint account, all that?
Exactly. It's about being proactive rather than reactive. And while those conversations might not always be the easiest, they can actually build a stronger foundation for your relationship because you're preventing resentment and misunderstandings from building up over time.
Okay, so we've talked about chores, finances, but what about those really big long-term goals, like marriage, kids, career changes, retirement? Those can feel especially intimidating for couples who haven't made that, formal commitment yet.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking, well, we're not married, so we don't need to talk about that yet. But the truth is, even if you're not sure if marriage is in the cards, or if you're even on the same page about those big life decisions, just having these conversations can be so valuable.
So it's not about pressuring each other into making a decision, but more about just understanding where each of you stands and whether your visions for the future are even compatible, right?
You got it. And even if you don't have all the answers right now, just having the conversation can create such a sense of transparency and understanding in the relationship. Maybe you agree to revisit the topic in a year, or maybe you discover that your goals are actually more aligned than you thought.
This all makes so much sense. It really ties back to what we were discussing earlier about, couples who are living together needing to be more intentional about creating structure. It's like they're building their own version of that framework that often comes, built in with marriage.
And the beauty of it is that they have the flexibility to create a structure that truly works for them. Without all the pressure of, societal expectations or traditions, they can define what commitment means to them and build a relationship based on that open communication and a shared understanding of how they want to navigate life together.
This whole conversation is making me think about all those little assumptions we make in relationships, whether we're married or not. We often just assume we're on the same page about things. But until we actually talk about it, we're really just setting ourselves up for potential misunderstandings and conflicts down the road.
That's so true. We all bring our own individual experiences and expectations into our relationships, and sometimes they just don't align perfectly. That's why those intentional conversations are so important. It's about bridging that gap between assumptions and reality and creating a shared vision for how you want to function as a couple.
So to recap, it's not about marriage being better than cohabitation. It's about recognizing that each type of relationship comes with its own set of dynamics, and that clear, open communication is essential for navigating those dynamics successfully.
Exactly. And the sooner couples start having those conversations, the better equipped they'll be to handle those inevitable disagreements that, come up in every relationship.
So, whether you're celebrating your 50th anniversary or just starting out on your relationship journey, remember that communication is key to building a strong and fulfilling partnership. All right, so we've talked a lot about communication, being open and honest with each other, all of that. But now I'm sure our listeners are like, okay, that's great in theory, but how do we actually do that? It's one thing to say talk to your partner,
Mhm.
but sometimes bringing up those, touchy subjects can be a little, well, intimidating. Like who's doing more chores around the house or talking about finances?
Oh, for sure. It's definitely easier said than done, especially when you're, worried about starting an argument. Nobody wants to ruin a perfectly good evening by launching into a debate about the budget. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that these conversations are productive, not destructive?
That's the key, right? Well, one thing that can really help is to go into these conversations with a team mentality. Instead of seeing it as, this battle where one person has to win, try framing it as a team effort where you're both working together to find a solution that works for both of you.
So less, you never do the dishes,
Sure.
and more like, hey, how can we make this whole chore situation work better for both of us?
Exactly. And another tip that can be super practical is to actually schedule time for these conversations. Might sound a little formal at first, but actually putting it on the calendar can help. It makes it feel less like a spontaneous argument and more like a planned discussion?
I like that. Like relationship check-in. Tuesday at 7 p.m., come prepared to talk about finances and bring your sense of humor.
Right, exactly. And then when you're actually having those conversations, try to use I statements instead of you statements. So,
Hmm.
for example, instead of saying, you always leave your clothes on the floor, you could say, I feel stressed when the bedroom is messy.
Ooh, that's good. It's about like owning your own feelings instead of putting the blame on your partner.
Exactly. And that can make them a lot more receptive to what you're saying.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of being receptive, active listening is so important, right?
Absolutely. When your partner is talking, really make an effort to actually understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
Put down the phone, make eye contact, actually listen to what they're saying. Don't just wait for your turn to talk.
So true. And something that can be really helpful is to repeat back what you heard, just to make sure you're both on the same page. So you could say something like, okay, I hear you. You're saying you feel overwhelmed when I leave my dishes in the sink, and I respect that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It shows your partner that you're taking their feelings seriously, which can go a long way in preventing those like little misunderstandings that can turn into bigger arguments.
Exactly. And remember, these conversations won't always be easy. It's normal to feel a little uncomfortable, and it's okay to disagree. The important thing is that you're both approaching the conversation with respect and a willingness to compromise.
It's interesting because we've been mainly focusing on couples who live together but aren't married. But really, so much of what we've talked about today applies to any relationship, right? Like
Yeah.
clear communication, active listening, finding compromises, all that. Those are all essential for a healthy partnership, whether you're married or not.
100%. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to figure out this whole relationship thing, right? How to create happy and fulfilling relationships. And whether you're celebrating 50 years together or just starting to figure out what it means to share your life with someone, that open communication is the foundation for building strong, lasting connections.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into, well, relationships, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest one is to remember that disagreements are totally normal. They happen in every relationship. It's how you handle those disagreements that really matters. It's what determines the health and happiness of your partnership.
Absolutely. And communication is key. Schedule that time for those important conversations. Really listen to each other. Use those I statements to express your feelings. All of that good stuff.
And finally, whether you're married or living together, you have the power to create a relationship that works for both of you. It might take some work, setting boundaries, defining roles, having those tough conversations about your hopes and dreams, but it's so worth it in the end.
That's a great way to put it. And with that, we're going to bring this deep dive to a close. We hope you found it helpful and insightful. And as always, we encourage you to keep the conversation going, not just with your partner, but with yourselves too.
Until next time, keep diving deep.